bringing this topic. Hey, I gave you the reminder. I want to thank you for bringing this topic forward. There's not a whole lot of agencies that utilize a peer program in their co-response. And I think that's what set Bexar County apart as an Ask the Expert. And love to hear everybody weigh in. But Jessica, I have a couple of questions for you. I was still working there when you were hired, and we started doing some training together. And I remember you asking me, how do you think I should be best utilized, right? Because this was kind of new ground. And I remember telling you, I just want you to go out there and have fun, right? I want you to go out there, have fun, and bring value and benefit to the team and to the community. So as you started out, could you talk a little bit about what it looked like when you went out on response, and then a little bit about what it looked like on the follow-up? Because I know on the follow-up side, you would ask me, hey, is it okay if I go to the hospital and make individual bracelets for the patients? And I mean, it was just very heartfelt human connection that you were able to provide. I think that's a missing component in a lot of co-responder teams. So could you spend just a couple of minutes talking about that?
Absolutely. So yes, when I first started, the role was not really built out yet. So I got to kind of create that role. But at first, I started on response and kind of shadowed a lot of the calls that we went to. But I was still able to participate with input that I noticed on the call to kind of build the picture of what was happening in that moment, and for us to collectively come up with the decision as the best way to support the consumer. And then on the follow-up side, I really wanted to have a way of individuals be able to remember me, because I know once you do go inpatient, they give you a ton of paperwork. It's very confusing. You see a doctor for just a very short period of time once a day. It's just, there's a lot going on. And so being someone, making sure I let them know I was not hospital staff and I was not with law enforcement, that I was just a peer coming to hear kind of what happened and how I could best support them from their standpoint. And so some of that stuff I did was like create self-care kits for them. Some of the stuff they couldn't have obviously in the hospital, but I wanted to have them something to take with them so that they could remember kind of that moment that we shared in the hospital of empowerment.
I'll jump in there real quick too and just say that, as far as Jessica and the folks like her, and I'll give credit to Ernie Stevens over there, because he was really pushing that part of the program once we kind of got our feet wet with the three components that we had with law enforcement, the emergency medical technicians, as well as the clinicians, is to really add that peer support element. And I think that turned out to be just a great move, on everybody's end, adding that, because I think it's really important that you have somebody that can identify with folks that can actually reach out, like kind of you said, like on that one-on-one on a personal level. Then that maybe some of us, because we're doing this coming from a professional angle, that may or may not be able to do. So I think that adding that was we had really great results from that from the beginning. And I think it really helped us close some loopholes. And the whole reason why we started the program was to really close loopholes. I'm sure everybody out there has seen it, where we were missing that vital element in our program, where we had a mental health unit to begin with, which, I'm proud to say, Bexar County was one of the first sheriff's office and law enforcement agencies to actually start a dedicated mental health unit. And this was a good 20 some odd years ago, before it was kind of the thing to do. But adding the SMART team, when we kind of, everything evolves, changes, and affects, and we figured out we're missing a big component to this, which was trying to get to people prior to a crisis and to take them out of that revolving door system. And just the effect in the county has been, I can't wait to see our stats. They actually going to, bring some stats out to show, effects on utilizers, or just on our call volume alone, how that's been affected things, which I know without even looking at it, it has. But I mean, adding that peer support element to it has been really successful on our end.
Jessica, could I ask like a logistical question?
Yes, ma'am.
For your teams, do you guys, do you all respond to the calls together? Is it always the clinician, the mental health deputy, the peer and the emergency medical staff? Or does it depend on the call?
Yes, so we would all respond together, but honestly, I think a peer is not fit for every single call. And so being able to step back and not participate in some that may be triggering for an individual due to their past experience, or maybe there are weapons involved, maybe someone gets aggressive, where they may not be in the headspace to be able to really hear a peer in that moment. And so I don't think peers are necessary on those types of calls, but a lot of times we would get more of the low level calls where people would be shutting down. They might have been sitting on a bridge looking sad or crying, things like that. And so I really think that bouncing back and forth between follow-up and response, that that they should be able to go on response because they do make a difference. But like I said, it's just not for every call.
Awesome. Thank you. We're incorporating peers into our program now and trying to figure out how to best utilize them. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. And if you have any questions on like safety, training, things like that, please let me know. I'm happy to answer anything I can.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Good afternoon. I just want to introduce myself a little bit. I'm Deputy Theodore Deaver. I work for the Sheriff's Office of Fort Bend County. So if you don't know the areas like Southwest Houston area, Sugar Land, Richmond, Rosenberg, and I am focused on the juveniles, but I have been doing mental health for the last 9 years. So I actually went to Bexar County, to San Antonio, and took the CIT youth class that they do.
Oh shit!
Okay, at a junior high out there. It was some years ago, probably about 8.5 years ago. But for the last almost 2 years, I focused on the juveniles, and I worked with Ethan on the OJJDP grant, and from that, I just came from a follow-up. So when you were talking about follow-ups, I provide resources and give some tactics on how to navigate insurance, how to navigate things that parents just don't understand. If parents think that, oh, I took my child to a mental hospital one time, oh, it should be done, she should get over it. So my job is to try to help push the family to get the help that they need, and so and keep people out of jail. So my question was, somebody said, I didn't get a name because I was trying to type. I think Jessica said it. You make care packages for people. Who did you give these care packages to, and what was inside of the care package?
Yes, thank you for the question. I originally had things like clean t-shirts, underwear, things that make their hospital stay a little bit more comfortable, because if you did not bring clothes, if you were not prepared to be hospitalized, you're going to get stripped down and put in paper scrubs, and it feels very dehumanizing. And the underwear they provide are not real underwear, things like that. So just having like a clean t-shirt or some underwear, some hygiene products. I also included like a grounding crystal in it for them to have when they got out of the hospital. So just to put with their belongings. And we kind of talked about that a little bit when we met, as far as like a coping skill, because I always keep one in my pocket. I also had some like Mad Libs or like crossword puzzles or things, so that they had something to do and keep their minds occupied, along with like a journal to kind of write about their experience, because even if it's the 15th time they've been hospitalized, that experience may be very different for them that time. Maybe something clicked, maybe they had a different doctor or a different hospital that just worked for them. So those are some things that I would put in the kits. And depending on the situation and the state in which they were at when I went to visit them at the hospitals, sometimes I would wait to give it to them later for like a home follow-up visit.
Do y'all have a memorandum of understanding with the hospital that allow you to go there and talk to the patients? Because at times because of HIPAA, they don't want to acknowledge that the person is there. So how did y'all cross that there?
Yes, I will speak to that, and then Lieutenant, if you have anything to add, please do. At first, it was a little bit of a challenge, honestly, when the program was newer and getting up and running. We ran into a little bit of hiccups, but we worked so closely with so many hospitals that over time, they got to know us, got to know what we looked like or what our shirts looked like, and we were able to get through just fine. But a lot of times, some of the front desk staff, especially at psychiatric hospitals, may need a little bit of education around HIPAA in emergencies. They just are, taught to say that to almost everybody that asks about patients in the hospital. So over time, working with those relationships was the best way for us to get that accomplished.
And so, yeah, that we handle the good part of this, I guess, is we can't, like Jessica said at the beginning of the team, that however you put your team together, we kind of started incorporating, and I know Ernie can attest to that too. We kind of started involving the hospitals in the conversation early on. So they knew as we were developing these teams, as we started these teams, we would have, sometimes it would be weekly or monthly meetings with hospital administration or some of the doctors that and nurses and things that work all the time with these patients, so they would understand what the program was from the jump. Now, as we started, there would be times where the team, whether it be Jessica or even coming in with law enforcement, where we would have a little kickback because they didn't know who we were. But that's why it's really important that you make connections with like the administration, with some of the people that are running the show there. Because honestly, what we would do a lot of times is we'd have to call those folks and say, hey, we're having an issue here, we're having an issue bringing somebody in, or they won't let us do a follow-up or whatever it is, and that resolved itself, So getting those people involved, and then of course it was a two-way street. We would tell them, hey, if you're having issues with the team, if there's anything you need us to do, please let us know. One little thing I did, which I actually told hospital administration, a lot of times they would have a hard time getting response with law enforcement with other issues that were going on in the hospital, whether it was, it could be something completely unrelated to why we were there. But I told them, look, if the deputies are in the hospital at the time that you need them for something else, whether you're having some type of issue with a patient or on the grounds, by all means, let them know. Because if they're there, as soon as they get done doing what they need to do, we're available to you until we go to the next call, whatever it is that you need. And that seemed to help a lot. They were very grateful for that, and they've actually taken advantage of that a few times. But definitely maybe reach out to that administration and tell them what they're doing. Most of the time, you're going to have really good response from them, because obviously everybody's goal is to keep these folks from revolving door in and out, not only jail, but the hospital system. They're walking into emergency rooms, and if we can prevent that, that prevents their staff from being overloaded, our staff from being overloaded. So it's kind of a win-win for everybody.
Thank you. Nobody else have questions?
I was just going to jump in, Deputy. I know there are a couple of questions that folks asked in the chat, but before we get to those, I actually wanted to piggyback on what Deputy Deaver was asking about, because I will admit my own ignorance. I don't know how this operates really. Jessica, as a peer, do you ever go out and respond to calls for juveniles? Because I imagine that responding to someone who's under 18 is going to be very different than an adult. But I do imagine that having someone on scene who has your life experience might be comforting to them, might help get through the call a little bit easier. So I was just wondering, do you ever go out on calls for juveniles? And if so, how's that look? And if not, why not?
at age?
Thank you, Ethan, for the question. Yes, we did respond to calls for juvenile as well. Honestly, that I love working with kids. I really do. I think everybody has their thing that is hard for them. For me, it's elderly. That's a harder population for me. But the kids I really do love. So for me, like I've learned just in some of my studies that, you know, a youth needs one stable adult in their life to really make a change. And so I get that opportunity to kind of build rapport with them and maybe explain things to them in a way that maybe patrol or our mental health deputy is explaining it. So giving kind of a different perspective, or maybe helping them understand what's going on and what the options are or what to expect going forward. And then really being able to circle back with those kiddos and follow up, and then, you know, kind of give them an opportunity to talk to someone that they're not being dragged to by their parents. It's not part of the school. It's just somebody that is coming to check on them and wants to support them. And so I kind of see it like big brother, kind of that role. But I really did enjoy working with the youth. Thank you.
Pause and see if there's anyone who wants to speak out loud, but otherwise I'll start with the questions in the chat. Okay, so the first question is, what are the ways you leverage your role as a peer and your personal experience to help inform the response of your co-responders?
A lot to digest. What are the ways that you leverage your role as a peer and your personal experience to help inform the response of your coworkers? For me, I was taught, once you kind of learn to develop the peer lens, that you can do it in any role. So even if I, you know, become a clinician, so on and so forth, that you still have like developed that lens. And so I think a lot of people, even in behavioral health or mental health, have worked with peers, but they may have like a very one-way street view of what a peer does. And so there is a little bit of psychoeducation on kind of what a peer looks like in the different roles, because maybe they just work with someone in recovery with peers or just on the mental health side. And so that portion, I think, is a very vital portion, because if they don't understand what you're doing and why you're there, they're not going to be able to utilize you very well as well. So being able to, like you said, leverage some of these personal and professional experience. And with the personal story part is just like sharing little snippets that are maybe valuable to the person in crisis, but is also very relevant to that. It's not just some, oh, telling a little bit about my story, because it's not about me in those moments. And so I think that is a skill that you have to develop, which is why I really think if you're going to hire a peer for crisis services, that they do need to be certified and they do need to have some previous experience working in some role, preferably some mental health.
Hey, Deirdre, and I'll say this about Jessica, because you just did something here today. The question was, right, and you answered it eloquently, but how did you help inform your co-responders as well? You did that a little earlier in something you said, and it just rolled off your tongue very nonchalantly. But when Deputy Deaver asked about what goes in this care package, and you started to describe it, and you said, you know, I put underwear in there because, you know, what they give you isn't even real underwear. As officers, we know where the front door is to a location. We know where to drop somebody off. Beyond that front door, we really don't know what that looks like. We don't know what you're going to be put into. We don't know what group therapy is. We don't know what one-on-one. We don't know, right? And what we don't know. At the back door, we don't know what happens on reentry back into the community. right? So when you said something like that, you just probably informed me, number one, but other co-responders on this call or on this webinar, what true human connection is when there's outreach by a peer, because you've been there, done that. So I want to thank you for bringing that up and saying it like, oh yeah, like this is what I do. But to me, I'm like, damn, that's empathy at its nth, right? At its most effective way for human connection. So I just want to throw that in, that you do that. And kudos to you for what you're doing for our community members. Thank you.
Thanks, Brittany.
We have a few more questions in the chat, but please, folks, feel free to unmute yourselves, or if you want to clarify something that you wrote in the chat, please feel free to ask additional follow-up. But the next question we received was, how does Jessica divide her time between response and follow-ups?
Honestly, that is a very delicate dance. We had 2 roles open for peers on our team. We had the budget for that, but we only had 1 peer at the time, which was myself. And so depending on what the week looked like or the previous week looked like, I would kind of design my schedule for that week, depending how many calls we had, how many people got ED'd, how many follow-ups we may had from before, things like that.
And does anyone have a sample policy on integrating peer support? That might be something to follow up with after the call, but are there some sample policies that could be shared, or even just talk about how you went about developing policies?
I will check and see. I know when we first developed the program, they did do some outlines that they had initially sent to us to kind of add along to the SMART program. So I'll be honest with you, off the top of my head, I can't remember some of the specific policies. It was along the line, same things that we were doing as far as the law enforcement component, et cetera. But I will be more than happy to share that with, if you want to make my email address available to anybody that needs it, I will be more than happy to share that.
Thank you. And
Hey, Detective Morris here with the Los Angeles Police Department. We have a crisis response team, and we also have a follow-up team. So just had a question about follow-ups for Jessica. We are going to try and do a little bit more extended reach out to our highest utilizers of services. And it sounds like you guys are doing some of that, especially with those care packages. What kind of success are you having? What's working for you? What's not working for you?
Thank you for the question. Honestly, high utilizers are a tough area. To me, it's really trying to collect the whole picture of what's going on. What barriers do they have maybe to treatment? What is going on in their personal life? What's going on in their relationships with work, kiddos, all of those things, because it's not usually just one thing that happens for a crisis. It's usually a combination of things. And so if we're just trying to look at, oh, well, you just need to take your medicine and go to your appointment and do all these things, maybe they don't have transportation, or maybe the clinic that they are recommended to go to because they're a high utilizer is across town. So really just trying to get to know them on a personal level enough to maybe get some insight into what we've been missing this whole time for them to continue to go into crisis, but also try to spend a little bit more time with the rapport part of trying to change the narrative of the system's broken, this is what happens, it's always the same, nothing's working, because there is other options out there, but I think a lot of times people will go and take medication. They don't like taking medication. It has side effects. They stop taking their medication. But kind of giving some insight into, maybe I take medication and I take medication every day, and I don't like taking medication, things like that, to share with them so that they can get a different perspective, hopefully.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Another question in the chat was, does your team have any parent peers? I know that can be very helpful for calls involving juveniles. I think that might be a follow-up to an earlier point.
We currently did not when I was with SMART. I 100% agree. I think family partners, parent peers, things of that sort are very helpful, especially with like psychoeducation when it comes to parents. But no, we did not have any, but I would love to see that, honestly.
Next couple questions might be for the lieutenant, but we received one question that's a little bit more logistical. How do you manage data collection on the CAD side and the RMS side? So I guess both of you talk about your experience with integrating data and the management systems.
Right. The IT questions. So what we did was basically we have a CAD system, we have an RMS. Currently we pull all of our data from our CAD system, but dispatch now, if like the intricate parts of it, I don't know how that works. However, what happens is we basically allowed them access to pull that SMART data, or I say our mental health calls, that way. And we actually rewind before we even started the team. That was one of the ways that we pushed for the team, was to be able to justify why we needed the team. So we showed how many mental health calls that would be available for SMART to actually pick up versus sending just a deputy to that call. So we use a CAD system for that integration. We also use that data every week. We have a meeting, and actually Ernie used to, host a lot of those for us, and we would go over all of that system data to see what calls are we still missing, what we could have went to. Dispatch actually went through, and through the CAD system actually had to prioritize and make calls what was going to be available for SMART. Because obviously there's certain calls we would not have SMART respond to if there was any type of weapon involved at the time. And we started out with just kind of go off on a little bit of a tangent. We kind of started off with a high bar. So it was basically calls that you would figure are cool to cold calls. It was, maybe depressed, no weapons, no history of violence, no active disturbance going on. Those would be the only calls that SMART initially would respond to. Then we started saying, okay, we're good with these calls. And we kind of amped it up a little bit and said, okay, well, now we'll start having SMART respond to calls. Maybe they might be a little higher in priority. Maybe there was a disturbance. Maybe he mentioned suicide with a weapon, but maybe didn't say how. And we would let deputies in the field would arrive at the scene, secure the scene, let us know, okay, it's safe, there's no active issues going on, then SMART would then respond. And so now we're at the point now, pretty much between that, we don't respond still to what we'd say hot calls initially. We have, once the scene has been secured, if SMART is nearby, go and do the follow-up. Maybe they'll do the emergency detention or the voluntary ED. But all of those numbers were like critically important to start the program. Everybody knows that, the idea is great and it always sounds great, but the first, numbers talk. Especially when you're investing money, as in positions, time, things of that nature. That was one thing that we had to sell to, like, for instance, for our commissioner's court was, and to the hospital system and to the Center for Healthcare Services, who is our mental health component to this. Look, we need, if everybody's got to donate X amount of staff, which that's a hard sell. When everybody's short everywhere, it's a hard sell. But when we are telling them about how much money we're going to save on the back end of this, because a lot of times, right, it's money and time that talks. We had a lot of buy-in with that. If we just dedicate, we'll see what this team results in. That's going to be less people going to the jail, which costs money, less people going in and out of the hospital, which costs money. But that CAD interface is important. Also, the mental health clinicians, and I know Jessica probably attest to this too, they are also on a system where they'll make notes in the clinician side of the reports. So they'll make notes on scenes and calls specifically for follow-ups. We just add the deputy to that, so they also can jump on there and make notes for follow-ups as well for the clinicians or for peer support, so that they know as far as the calls and how that works. So, but so eventually eventually, basically, we were able to use that to our advantage. But the CAD system, integrating that is vitally important.
So I had a quick question regarding what you just said. So if I heard you correctly, you're actually letting social services, for whether it's peers or whether it's clinicians, actually make entries into your RMS portion of your system.
Right. So we go through STRAC, right, which is our agency partner in this. So we actually set up an MOU where STRAC is allowed to have that data. So STRAC is kind of like, they're kind of in the middle. So they're actually basically coordinating a lot of this. So what we did was we made arrangements for STRAC to have access to our data to use for that purpose. And it's IT stuff. I don't know how all that works. However, that's the bottom line of it. Yes, we did. And vice versa, right? So we also have access to their data, the notes that when it only pertains as to this program.
Ernie, I saw that you chatted a question. Do you want to ask it out loud?
Yeah, and it kind of goes into this data and the data sharing, because part of the logistics when Jess was hired was, she has to go through a background, right? And that seems to be like, this is the dumbest crap, right? Because you got to do a background check. Sorry, I know it's recorded. You got to do a background check. That is just who I am. And of course, a peer most likely is going to have, some entries in their criminal history, right? But that can't be a barrier to build out these teams. The biggest challenge was being able to get a peer to pass a background check and then be CJIS certified to be able to sit in a vehicle with an officer that has access to CAD, right? So these are the things you have to think about. And the lieutenant and her foresight and leadership, and with STRAC's assistance and the Center for Healthcare Services, they were able to create that policy and make that happen as long as the peers could pass the background in the CJIS, right? And it's very difficult to find a really good peer that's not going to get disqualified along the way. So that's some of the logistics that you have to think about as you're building out these teams. One of the questions I wanted to throw out there as well was sometimes Jess would go out on follow-ups on her own. And it wasn't always just to a hospital. Sometimes it was to the patient's home or wherever they were staying at. So I wanted to ask the lieutenant if she could talk to that about how did you determine when to send security with her or when to let her go on her own. And last question, that's not in the chat. I do want to get around to just asking you about how did you self-reflect and do your own self-care, being that these calls are never ending for you and you see the trauma that other people are being affected by. So LT, if you could start, Jeff.
So yeah, going back to kind of our original question, right? Why it was so important that we're sharing data, not just for numbers. I mean, that's very, very important, right? But for security purposes. So, and we actually just probably within the last year really started working this because, like we said, now we have, whether it's a clinician or a peer that's going to do a follow-up, it was vitally important that they knew what the situation was. We had, and Ernie can attest to this, we had, as we started the program, we had a couple little, oh my gosh, somebody did a follow-up because they see, oh, we went out to this house, maybe we ED'd the individual, and then a couple days later, like, oh, well, I'm going to go do my follow-up. And we wrote notes like, hey, make sure that you send law enforcement, or make this person, became combative once we got to the hospital, or this person was resistant to, and there was no good way to make sure that, number one, law enforcement was communicating right with the clinicians, or the clinicians were communicating back with law enforcement. So what we did was, a part of that system was to make notes that they would have access to. So number one, we would put on there, hey, don't send a follow-up team without law enforcement. Or, you know what, this one's clear for a follow-up, we didn't have any issues, etc. I mean, we started getting so to the point where it was like, oh, and FYI, they have 3 dogs. So when you go to the house, don't be afraid, we didn't have any issues, or they're aggressive. And it was all kinds of little bitty things, but it was super useful. What myself and I instructed my supervisors were to do is that if there was any element of we felt there could be potential violence in their background. If the address is what we call flagged, which I know a lot of law enforcement here will know what I mean. Flagged an address. In other words, we've had issues. They've fought with law enforcement before, or they have a history. They have a history of violence. Right away, we would flag that address. Well, now we're able to let them know, hey, this address was flagged by law enforcement. So for me, obviously, if it's flagged by law enforcement, they're not going by themselves. So we're going to send a law enforcement component with them for their security. The sergeants are really good about reading the notes. If they feel like, this one was kind of iffy, they'll let them know and say, hey, Jessica, hold up, we'll go with you. Or you know what, wait till if they're in the hospital setting, that's a little more secure. Why don't you do the follow-up there versus going to their home, things of that nature. So going back to that data sharing, not only number-wise, right, but informational-wise, it was super important that we were able to communicate back and forth on a system that everybody has access to. So we wanted to make sure that, you know, their safety is number one. Obviously, the deputy's presence on the team is for that reason. Not only because in the state of Texas, only law enforcement can sign those emergency detentions. So in order to do that for the field, so we would need a law enforcement component to that no matter what, but also for the security of the peers, the clinicians, and the medical personnel that are riding on the team or riding with the team. So, and they know what that's their role. And oftentimes when we started the program, because we were dealing with a lot of times at the beginning it was high utilizers. And then we found, we're starting to break into folks that have never been handled before, which is really great because we're catching them on the front end, not the back end. Our high utilizers were familiar with our mental health deputies. So that sometimes that helped because maybe they weren't familiar so much with the clinician at that point, but they were familiar with the law enforcement. So sometimes that worked to our advantage as well. Like because the deputies already had relationships with them, but kind of, you know, circling back, you absolutely have to have some type of information sharing for safety, security, all of that good stuff, just above and beyond budgets and how the team is being successful.
Yes, and I just want to add to what Lieutenant said. I have access to them as well. If there was anything that I maybe saw that I was not comfortable going to for whatever reason, or maybe I drove up to the home and it's like an entryway where it's one way in, one way out. Maybe they do have a bunch of dogs outside or no trespassing kind of signs, just some red flags where I may have some hesitancy to go by myself. Every time that happened, Bexar County, STRAC, my direct supervisors made sure that an officer went with me. So they could either meet me there or I could leave and then, you know, come back, whatever it was. But they really wanted to prioritize our safety. And then Ernie, your question was about like self-care and reflection with dealing with trauma as a peer. I feel like that's kind of the elephant in the room, but I'm glad you asked the question. Yes, this is definitely something that is very important. Honestly, for me, the trauma doesn't affect me in the ways that most people would think. It's more of like when our systems fail an individual or things like that, that really were hard to not take home. But I also had mentioned earlier about having previous experience. So if they're certified and they have previous experience, they have kind of worked on developing that like mental muscle that you have to build and develop, where you leave enough in your own cup to be able to refill your cup again for the next day or at the end of the evening so that you could do it again tomorrow. But if you just give and give and give and give, which peers are very passionate and want to do, but they have to learn how to be able to take care of themselves in that process. But I think it does take practice. I also think having safety, feeling safe on your team, being able to say, hey, I am not comfortable with this. Hey, this is triggering for me. Hey, I don't want to go on this call, whatever it is, just feeling safe within your team so that you can show up as your best self. And if something happens, that they have your back.
Thank you so much. So we did receive a few other questions. It looks like someone has a question about body worn cameras when you're ready. Did you want to take yourself off mute and ask?
Yeah, I had a question. We currently run a co-responder program. We've navigated it with policy regarding that topic for body worn cameras, but I was just curious to see if you guys had any challenges or speed bumps regarding peer involvement and body cameras and what that looks like.
I don't think we've had any issues with that. The deputies, obviously, we have a body worn camera policy. The deputies are required to wear body worn camera at all times. And obviously it's activated on any calls for service or any interactions with the public. We have not had any kickbacks with that at all. Obviously anybody that has access to that body worn camera would have to go through outside of court purposes, right? Subpoenas, all that kind of good stuff. So we haven't had any issues with that. Jessica, I don't think, right? You haven't had any issues on your side at all, right? With the body worn camera?
No, ma'am.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Just to add to a little bit of that body worn camera, we started about 6 months ago, and we haven't had a problem because they are able to redact the entire person from the body worn camera. Because that was one of my concerns, that we would film people on their worst day, and somebody can find that and use that against them in the future. So they said that they are able to redact them out of the video. So I don't know what camera system y'all are using. We're using Axon, and they say it could be done. I haven't had any hands-on experience or anything with it, but that was one of my concerns and my questions from the beginning of use.
We were just looking at it more from the perspective of building a relationship, near a crisis or during one, with an individual feeling like they were being recorded with audio and video, and the outcomes. We're trying to achieve better outcomes, right?
Right.
So the effects of the camera, I was just curious to see. We've unpacked it with co-responder models, but we really haven't dived into it with peers. So that's why.
Yeah, and I don't know, like Jessica would probably say, but I mean, we haven't really had any issues. I mean, even with now our peers, to my understanding, right, Jessica, I mean, you guys aren't outfitted with body worn camera, correct? It's just the officers. So we haven't, and even when the officers are on scene with the peer or with the clinician, they're kind of trained to kind of be in the background, kind of be the wallpaper unless they're needed. So that seems to work well. They don't really pay too much attention to that. And from what I understand and talking to the group, we haven't had any kickback from anybody as far as or worried about the cameras, so to speak. Are the folks that ride on the deputies that are assigned to the SMART team, obviously they have a polo shirt or like a button down fishing looking shirt. It's a very soft uniform, for lack of a better term. They do have body worn camera, but again, like I said, it hasn't seemed to be, we haven't been presented with too many issues with folks because we have the camera. And I guess nowadays, in this day and age, if anything, sometimes it may even be assistance. They know that, hey, we're recording the interaction, nothing dangerous is going to happen to them. We have, the camera to show that. And so now it's almost like, I think we're starting to see the reverse of that, where folks, I think, maybe like the fact that we have the body worn camera on. But again, only our law enforcement are equipped with that at this point.
And one other point on the body worn camera that you can think about as you build out these teams is Jessica actually was employed by the Center for Healthcare Services, which is the local mental health authority, which they don't have a body worn camera policy, right? And they don't wear body cameras. So that really did not apply to her or her interactions with members of the public, or whenever she would go into the hospitals or treatment facilities to meet with the patients. So it wasn't even a concern. Now, if your agency employs your peer, that's something to look at. I mean, you probably have to run that by your city attorney or whatever, but again, I just don't know how that would really relate to a civilian wearing a camera that's having these HIPAA protected conversations with patients. So something to think about as you're putting your policy together.
And I was just going to add, we didn't have many people that were either offended or afraid because of the body cams. Honestly, I like it because of the safety aspect. And I was on one call where someone had mentioned being recorded, and basically responded with, this is my team. They're here to keep me safe. They're here to keep you safe. And I care a lot about this team, and I care a lot about you. And then just kind of keep going with like an open-ended question. And then kind of circling back, if it came up again with that same, just we're here to keep you, you safe, myself safe, etc. So.
I saw a question that popped up there about how the positions are funded. So as of right now, well, initially, when we started the program, the way the positions were funded was each element, whether it was our emergency medical folks, the sheriff's office, our mental health authority, which is Center for Health Care Services, donated, for lack of a better term, right, a member for the team. So initially, the sheriff's office, right, we had 2 paid deputies that started. Sheriff's office funded it by donating those deputies to that team. And then as well as Center for Healthcare Services placed a clinician on the team, and we had our emergency medical folks place a paramedic on the team, and everybody ate their individual cost. As the team expanded, we actually qualified for ARPA funds, and we were actually able to use, commissioners got awarded X amount of money for ARPA funds, and so much of that was going to go to mental health. We put a proposal together, asked to expand the team, and now we have 4 positions as of right now that are getting paid through the ARPA funds, which has been tremendously helpful. So we have 4 more deputies, clinicians, EMTs that are funded now by ARPA. As of right now, and how long that lasts, I don't know. I know at least for 3 years, I think was our tentative deal. So so it's half and half, 50-50 now. So half of the team is paid by the sheriff's office, and the other half right now is by ARPA funding.
Jessica, could you talk a little bit more? I know we had a call last week and you were talking about kind of professional pathways for peers. Do you mind sharing a little bit about that as well?
Absolutely. So typically, even certified peers are not paid very well. So it's really hard for individuals to, for one, work in this field as a peer, but also to try to continue their education. And so there hasn't been a clear path for peers to like career ladder wise of a way to get further education. You can get different types of certifications, like a supervisor, peer support specialist position, things like that. But I think if you're going to be hiring peers, that one, please pay them well, and 2, that they have some kind of initiative, whether it's tuition reimbursement program, even like a professional development stipend, whatever it is, for them to continue their education, because they do have all the passion and drive to want to help and be of service. But if we're not paying them and they can't take care of their own health, or they don't have anywhere to go from there, then it's easy for them to experience burnout.
I can't help it. I love this. I got to keep asking questions, and I'm sorry, but keep sending your questions in. We'll answer them. Jess, so a couple of things. One, I'd like to know, how did you feel that the team accepted you when you were first hired, as far as the culture, right? And then number 2, when a co-response team goes out, law enforcement kind of gauges success by, hey, we didn't have to use force, right? We got this thing accomplished. The social workers are like, hey, we didn't even have to do an ED. We were able to de-escalate, refer for services, or go voluntarily, right? How did you gauge success engaging with a patient?
That's a good question. I'm not more tied up with the outcome. It's more about the best way to support that person in the moment. So even if it's having a heart-to-heart, peer-to-peer conversation, if they're shut down, following up with them at the hospital on the back end the next day. But I feel like peer work is like, you can't really explain it, that once you see it, you know it, like, you know what we're talking about. But yeah, I think there are sometimes people should be ED'd and that's the right move, but also sometimes they meet criteria for being ED'd, but that doesn't fix what got them in the situation in the first place. And then when they get out, it throws them right back into that issue. So I try to really take the whole health approach and really look at all the barriers, the risk, the protective factors, and come up with like a individualized plan for what is going to work the best. But from personal story, I have been in crisis many times. I have gone through that process many times, and it wasn't like a specific type of person or like a first responder or any of that. Every time that I had like that moment that pushed me forward, it was just a human being being a human being in that moment for me. So it could have been, you know, a nurse at the hospital saying, well, you're having a shit day today, so I'm here to help. Or, you know, I believe you in your story. I'm sorry that this is happening to you, but I do believe you. Things like that, where they feel that you see them, I think is the best way to measure success for me.
Thank you. We did receive another question in the chat. Is the SMART group all in one office space, or do you all meet up on a call for service from separate places?
So we all actually have initially our own office spaces, but what we ended up doing was decide to start meeting collectively at the beginning of our shifts, and we decided to use our substations for those meetups, being because obviously they're located on the west side of the county and then on the east side of the county. So the clinician and, you know, the deputy along with our mental health unit, which is actually located down in our downtown office. So initially at the very beginning of shift, you know, everybody's got their equipment, they drive out, they meet at the substations, and they deploy from there. So and we just went to our paramedics. We actually got narcotics safe installed in each one of the subs, so now they're not having to run back to their main locations to pick up any type of, you know, first aid or any refills on basic medications or narcotics that they need. We actually got that done, which has been a good help, so they don't have to do a lot more running back and forth. We afforded a team a cubicle with inside the substations that's just for SMART. If they need to complete reports or now sometimes they'll still go back, maybe they need to go back to an office to get something in particular they don't have out at ours, but for the most part, we try to keep them together and have everything they need in one place. And right now we're using our substations to do that.
And is that one SMART team for the county, or are there more than one?
So we started out with 2 teams, and it was 1 team per shift. And our county is very large. So what we figured out was we were plenty busy, but most of that day was driving. So if you're familiar with Bexar County or San Antonio, you realize that you could be on one side of San Antonio and it would legitimately take you, without traffic, 40 minutes to make it to the other side of San Antonio. So that was an issue. And we were seeing it in the numbers, even though these guys were busy all day. If you looked at their time, a lot of their time was spent driving from the east side to the west side of the county, the west side to the east side of the county. So when we expanded the team, when we received our ARPA funds, that's when we expanded the team and we placed 1 team on the east side and 1 team on the west side. And we currently have 4 teams altogether. So we have 2 on day shift and 2 on second shift. We're looking to expand to overnights. That's a work in progress right now, because just like everybody else, staffing is an issue. Hiring right now is an issue. But that's our goal, is to be 24/7, 7 days, and be able to cover all 3 shifts. As of right now, we are first shift, second shift. So our SMART team runs from 6 in the morning until 10 o'clock at night.
One logistic question. I know I said I was going to be quiet, I swear. But Lieutenant talked about the narcotic boxes at the substations. If you're going to do that with a medic, you may have to, Lieutenant, correct me if I'm wrong, you may have to make that location a DEA location for the medication.
It is. It has to be, you're correct, Ernie. It has to be a certified DEA location, and they'll do it for you. You just have to go through their process. And there's certain ways you have to actually have it stored and secured. But it really broke. It was very easy. It was nothing complicated. Once we actually obtained the units to secure the narcotics in, by their standard, basically they issue what they call it like a DEA license to say, hey, this particular spot right here is allowed just to store anything that would be considered a narcotic. So, but it's not, it doesn't take us. And normally your first responder medical side, they know exactly how to do that. They do that with every one of their own substations, fire departments, etc. So we actually let our medical EMT side of the house handle that. And once we got the licenses, we were good to go.
Anyone else have a question that they want to ask?
So earlier, y'all were talking about when y'all respond, it was kind of more like a backup, not a now situation, a hot, I think you use that term, a hot situation. So we have a co-responder model and we work with our mental health authority, Texana here. And working with them, they have vests and they ride around in the car with us. And so they won't get out of the car until we get them out of the car, like, all right, now come. And I'm not trying to say they're a dog, but like K9, we come back and say, all right, come get out of the car, assist these people. And so I don't want nobody to think that I'm disparaging anyone, but we'll try to make sure that the scene is safe for them to do the interview process, so we can decide if we're going to transport them. So have y'all ever tried to do that model where y'all all ride together? If so, what happened?
So we do that. Initially the call, it starts with the call being dispatched. Initially the deputies and usually the supervisor will look at the call. Dispatchers are trained to say, okay, this call is smart, qualified or not. Sometimes dispatch doesn't catch the calls because things happen, or other times, whether it's a hot call or coded call, but let's say it's a medium call that they're going to go to. Their standard procedure is the deputies, the clinician and the EMT all go together, but we're in separate vehicles. So the deputy's in one vehicle and the clinician and the EMT and the peer maybe are in another vehicle together. So we kind of call it the pickles bus. The pickles bus follows us out to the call. And then the deputies, obviously, no matter what kind of call it is, even if it comes out as a cold call, they go and make sure the scene is secured first. And it's kind of the same thing. They let the clinicians, okay, you guys are good to go. You can come up, etc. Kind of exactly the way that you do it. Now, the reason why they wouldn't go right away to, let's say, a hot call, and it's happened before where dispatch is actually assigned smart to a call with a man with a gun threatening his family, threatening to kill himself, and that's on me. That's a no-go for the smart team, only because the county is so large, and I have deputies that they're still in that mindset, right? They're going to take off, and knowing my luck, they're going to be the first ones there. And I want to make sure that, and because they do all go together, they don't really stage, they all kind of come in together. We don't allow them to arrive at that call until patrol normally makes that scene and secures it. And I say patrol because one set of deputies say, you guys are good. Then we come in and I still have a second set of deputies with the clinician in that. And that's just the way we set up our protocol. Because the county is so large that if they did need help, it would be a hot minute before somebody else may be able to get there. So that's just kind of a security thing that we put in. To give you an example, and I just happened to be listening to the radio that evening, but it was a similar call to that. And dispatch, I'm not 100% sure how it happened. We got newer dispatchers. They got dispatched to that call. And right away, the supervisors are like, whoa, hold on, hang on. Because, the deputies will take off, But so we have to catch those calls sometimes still, where it's like, or if sometimes details are coming in, it starts out as a cool call, like, oh, the person is possibly depressed and suicidal. And then by the time the call is working and the call taker is adding information to the notes, it changes to it's an active threat. He's got a gun. He's standing on the street or things of that nature. And so that's why we just make sure that if it rises to the level where they actively have a weapon or actively threatening to harm other people, that we have the deputies actually make the scene first. But we do a normal call would all travel, arrive together. Same thing, deputies make sure it's secure and kind of, like you said, let the canines out and then they go do what they need to do on the back end of that. And I think Jessica can attest too. I mean, a lot of times the call changes as you guys are on your way to them. And I'm sure there's been times where you're head there, you're like, whoa, hold on, kind of hit the brakes for a second because the call is evolving. And sometimes the call's fine until they get there and then the call evolves. And that's why, again, that's why the deputies are there. You know, we've had a few instances where, yeah, it got a little lively. And, but that's just kind of the nature of the beast with these calls. And that's why I'm kind of super, especially with the deputies, I really, and if you're starting a program, you really have to impress upon your law enforcement partners that are involved in the team that is their job to keep up with that call. And it's their job to, you know, push the brakes if something doesn't look right. Along with the clinicians and things of that nature, we've had it even come up where the clinician or the peer has worked with this person before and we never have. And they're like, whoa, hold on, because I can tell you already he's going to be, so it's very important that everybody communicates, not afraid to say, hey, I don't like the feel of this one, or there's too much unknown information, and are able to tell dispatch, okay, hold on, we'd like patrol to make that scene first. Or you know what, the deputies are going to make that scene first, even if it's within the unit. Like sometimes I've had the mental health, the smart guys go, as they got closer to the call, they're the first deputies, technically even closer than patrol. And they'll say, hey, you know what, we'll go ahead and make it before patrol, but we're going to have the clinician, you know, and the paramedic just stage a minute down the street before they actually roll up with us because we're kind of unsure about this one. But it's really important that everybody communicates on the team and is not afraid to say anything, because it's happened numerous ways a few times.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to add to that about safety with a peer when going to calls. I think some of the things that I was very proactive about was learning radio communication. You are a body on that team at the scene. Things like scene safety, standard operating procedures, and having regularly scheduled supervisions where they have the option to debrief on a regular basis. I think it's easy when you're short-staffed and everybody's short-staffed to kind of skip some of those if everything seems okay and we're trucking along. But I really think that they need to be scheduled and that peers, even if they aren't going to debrief, maybe they just have some questions, or maybe they'd like your feedback on a call that they felt didn't go as well as they wished it did. And then feeling safe within the team, kind of what Lieutenant touched on. And part of that, I think, is being able to communicate maybe some of your triggers with your team. Like, if this is the situation, I don't want to go. If this, if I'm on the scene and I feel like I need to step away for a minute, I'm going to let someone know and step away for a minute. Just to be able to compartmentalize some of their own personal and professional experience to prevent countertransference.
Any other questions? The chat is slowed a bit, but if anyone has questions that they want to ask, please feel free to unmute and speak up.
Okay, well, I'm gonna be Ernest Jr. over here and ask all of the questions. So when we started the co-responder model, we don't have EMS, but we make sure that EMS is aware if we need them. And just recently we had to change policy because of our lack of staff. I don't know if everybody else is feeling that, but we are short about 130 people at our agency. So we used to be the backup, but now at times we have to be the first ones on scene. So we make sure that we take care of those co-responders, or Texana in our case. But also they're putting Texana into dispatch, because a lot of times dispatch, they're sending us out to calls that we don't need to go to. They just needed to talk to somebody on the phone. So we are adding to Texana peer support, like what y'all would call peer support. We're adding 2 of them in dispatch so that they can run calls that they're unsure of through them. So right now they're currently in training. So that may be something also that may help y'all because getting better information or getting using your tools wisely may help in the long run because we sometimes run. I know you talked about 45 minutes to get from one side of San Antonio to the other. I will be happy with that, but our 885 square miles, sometimes it has taken me an hour and 30 minutes to get to the other side of the county. So I can be in places that I don't get phone or radio service. So it's important just to utilize your tools because I've gone very far and then I get 10 minutes away and they say, hey, we don't need you anymore. So it's important to use your tools wisely.
I'm not going to let Theo have the last word. So let's wrap with this, right? Because I know we're over on time. Yeah, you're talking about bringing peers in dispatch, peers in 988 centers now, peers for warm lines. I mean, peers, your ship has come in. Like, we need you. The community needs you. They need your services. Jessica, I will say this to you, and I'll pass it to close. Thank you for coming on and doing this. I know webinars are not very comfortable for everybody, and you've never been one to want the spotlight on you, but you have earned the spotlight with your vulnerability and your authenticity, and it makes you who you are. You have made Bexar County and the community a better place because of your services and your dedicated desire to connect with other humans. So on behalf of the council, state governments, myself specifically, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I think we do have about 15 minutes.
Yeah, Ernie has decided we're wrapping early, apparently. So there is one last question that has already come in. I'll pose it. If no other questions come in, we can wrap early. But let's call this the last call on questions. So we have a question, Jessica, I think this is for you. What are other ways that your co-responders can support you in your peer role with the added complexity of how responding to calls may impact you personally and professionally?
That's a great question. Thank you. Honestly, it really comes down to safety. I know that's kind of cliche to say, but feeling safe within your team. They don't need to know the details and the whys to what's going on or what boundaries you have around things, but you do need to be able to communicate some of your triggers, some things that may be off the table for you, whatever it is, because you don't want to be on a call and then try to communicate that in the middle of the scene. So just having them kind of know ahead of time so that if they see something coming before you do, that they can let you know that maybe you need to step away for a minute or go back to the car or whatever it is. But I think building camaraderie within the team, feeling comfortable with the team, having open communication about some of the difficulties and challenges that you may have on the calls, so that they better understand you as a peer and what your struggles are. I did want to touch on one thing before we completely close up around like training. So there's not a training that I know about for peers in crisis services, but some of the things that really helped me along the way was, I know Deputy Deaver mentioned CIT training. So participating in crisis intervention training for law enforcement, I think was beneficial to them, but was also beneficial to me to kind of better understand why they make the decisions that they do, more of some of the tactical side, just some education on some things that I wasn't quite familiar with. But I also think it gave a good opportunity for law enforcement to ask me questions that they normally wouldn't ask. Other trainings that I think were important were things like motivational interviewing, trauma-informed care, and person-centered approach, I think are really important.
Thank you so much. So no additional questions have come in. really want to thank Jessica and Lieutenant Freveletti for being here, for talking about the work that you're doing. This has been so helpful. I think there were a couple questions about follow-ups in terms of emails or resources. So for those of you that are grantees on the line, if you did have a follow-up, please feel free to reach out either to myself or your TA coach directly, and we can try to close that loop for you to get you the resources that you asked for. And again, this will be recorded and we'll be able to let you know when it's up and posted on the website. You can share it with members of your teams that could not be here today. Thank you both again so much for taking the time out to talk to us on this really important topic. It is really appreciated. I'm gonna kind of just hang out here and let you can head out, but if you did want to add an email address or something to the chat, feel free. But thank you all so much. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Yep, there will be a recording available. It will not be searchable, so it won't be like a regular webinar. But the recording will be privately posted and we can share the link with the attendees.
Good stuff today, Deirdre. I'll talk to you soon. You are muted.
I see that. I'm gonna thanks everyone, and I'm gonna go ahead and end the session.
Take care.